The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace, as King Edmund strode through the grand corridors, his footsteps echoing with purpose and barely contained fury. The servants pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, recognizing the storm brewing in their monarch's usually composed demeanor. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white beneath his ornate rings. Behind him, trailing at a respectful distance, walked Lord Chancellor Marcus Aldridge, a man who had served the crown for over 2 decades and had never seen the king in such a state. The Chancellor's weathered face bore deep lines of concern as he struggled to keep pace with his sovereign's determined stride. In his hands he clutched a leather portfolio containing documents that had arrived at dawn, documents that had shattered the peaceful morning like a thunderclap. The scandal had broken just hours earlier when a palace maid, young Sarah Whitmore, had stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. While cleaning the private apartments reserved for honored guests, she had discovered a collection of letters hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the chamber occupied by Lady Camilla Thornfield, the king's cousin-in-law. These were not ordinary correspondence, but detailed communications revealing a conspiracy that struck at the very heart of the monarchy. Lady Camilla had been living at the palace for nearly 3 years, ever since her husband, the king's beloved cousin, Lord Geoffrey Thornfield, had perished in a tragic hunting accident. The court had embraced her as a grieving widow deserving of protection and comfort. She had been given apartments in the East Wing, a generous allowance, and the freedom to come and go as she pleased. The king himself had insisted on this arrangement, moved by what he believed was genuine sorrow and helplessness. But the letters Sarah had found painted a completely different picture. Written in Camilla's elegant handwriting, they detailed secret meetings with representatives of the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria, Ravencrest's oldest rival. The correspondence revealed that Camilla had been systematically gathering information about the kingdom's military defenses, trade agreements, and most shocking of all, the personal habits and weaknesses of the royal family itself. One letter in particular had made the king's blood run cold. Dated just 2 weeks prior, it described in intimate detail the layout of the royal private quarters, including the location of hidden passages that only the most trusted members of the household should have known about. Another letter discussed the timing of the king's daily routines, his preferred walking routes through the palace gardens, and even the schedule of the royal guards. The most damning piece of evidence was a letter that outlined a plan to introduce Valdorian agents into the palace staff during the upcoming harvest festival, when the palace would be at its most vulnerable with hundreds of visitors and temporary workers moving through its halls. Camilla had apparently been working to create opportunities for foreign spies to infiltrate the very heart of the kingdom. As King Edmund processed this betrayal, his mind raced back through the past 3 years, searching for signs he might have missed. He remembered how Camilla had always been particularly interested in palace security, asking innocent-seeming questions about the guards' rotations and the castle's defensive capabilities. He recalled her frequent requests to tour different parts of the palace, always with some plausible excuse about wanting to feel closer to her late husband's memory. The king's trusted advisor, Sir Robert Blackwood, had raised concerns about Camilla's activities months earlier, but Edmund had dismissed them as paranoia. Robert had noticed that Camilla seemed to have an unusual number of visitors for someone in mourning, and that she often took long rides alone into the countryside, sometimes not returning until after dark. The king had attributed this to grief and a need for solitude, but now these behaviors took on a sinister new meaning. Lord Chancellor Aldridge cleared his throat nervously as they approached the East Wing. "Your Majesty," he said in a low voice, "perhaps we should consider the broader implications before taking action. Lady Camilla's family has significant holdings in the northern provinces, and her brother serves on the royal council. If we move against her without absolute certainty," the king stopped so abruptly that the chancellor nearly collided with him. Edmund turned, his eyes blazing with a fury that made the older man step back involuntarily. "Absolute certainty?" The king's voice was dangerously quiet. "We have her own words, Marcus, written in her own hand. Letters describing military secrets she had no right to know. Plans to bring foreign agents into my palace. What more certainty do you require?" The chancellor bowed his head, properly chastened. He had known Edmund since the prince was a boy, had watched him grow from an impetuous youth into a wise and just ruler. In all those years, He had rarely seen the king's composure crack, but this betrayal had shaken Edmund to his core. The violation of trust, the abuse of the sanctuary he had provided to someone he considered family, had awakened a cold rage that burned more fiercely than any hot anger. As they continued toward Camilla's apartments, the king's mind turned to the implications of this discovery. If Camilla had been feeding information to Valdoria for 3 years, how much damage had already been done? What secrets had she already passed along? The kingdoms had been enjoying a period of relative peace, but there had been troubling signs recently. Valdorian merchants who seemed unusually well-informed about Ravencrest's trade routes, diplomatic missions that had encountered unexpected difficulties, and reports of strange activities along the border. The palace guards they encountered along the way snapped to attention as their sovereign passed, but Edmund barely acknowledged them. His thoughts were consumed with the systematic betrayal that had been unfolding under his very roof. Every kindness he had shown Camilla, every gesture of familial loyalty, had been twisted into an opportunity for espionage. The private dinners where he had shared his concerns about kingdom affairs, the family gatherings where sensitive matters were discussed, the informal conversations in the palace gardens, all of it had been fuel for her treacherous fire. When they finally reached the ornate doors of Camilla's chambers, the king paused for just a moment, his hand resting on the polished brass handle. Behind these doors lay the woman he had welcomed as family, the person he had sought to comfort in her supposed grief. The irony was not lost on him that while he had been trying to heal what he thought were the wounds of loss, she had been methodically working to wound his kingdom. The sound of feminine laughter drifted through the heavy wooden doors, followed by the clink of fine china. Camilla was apparently entertaining guests, as she so often did. The king's jaw tightened as he wondered who might be in there with her. More Valdorian contacts, perhaps, or unwitting members of his own court being pumped for information over tea and delicate pastries. Lord Chancellor Aldridge positioned himself beside the door, his hand moving instinctively to the ceremonial sword at his side. The king's personal guard, Captain Thomas Fletcher, appeared at the end of the corridor, having received word that his presence might be required. Fletcher was a man of few words but absolute loyalty, someone who had proven his dedication to the crown countless times over his years of service. The king took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This confrontation would mark a turning point, not just in his relationship with Camilla, but in how he viewed trust and loyalty within his own household. The innocence of assuming the best in people, particularly family members, had been shattered by the discovery of these letters. From this moment forward, he would need to be more cautious, more suspicious, more willing to believe that even those closest to him might harbor dark intentions. As he prepared to push open the doors and confront the traitor within, King Edmund felt the weight of his crown more heavily than ever before. The burden of leadership had always been significant, but now it carried the additional load of betrayal and the knowledge that his kindness had been exploited in service of his enemies. The woman beyond these doors had not only violated his trust, but had potentially put his entire kingdom at risk with her treacherous activities. The moment had come to act to show that while he might be capable of great kindness and generosity, he was also capable of swift and decisive justice when the security of his realm was threatened. With one final look at his advisors, the king pushed open the doors to begin a confrontation that would echo through the palace halls for years to come. The heavy oak doors swung open with a dramatic creak that cut through the cheerful conversation like a blade through silk. King Edmund stepped into the lavishly appointed chamber, his imposing figure filling the doorway as sunlight streamed behind him, casting his shadow across the Persian rugs and fine tapestries that adorned Lady Camilla's private sitting room. The scene before him was one of comfortable domesticity that made his blood boil even hotter. Lady Camilla Thornfield sat gracefully at an ornate tea service, her golden hair perfectly arranged and her silk gown the color of deep emeralds. Across from her sat Lady Helena Ravensholm, the daughter of a prominent court family, and beside her, young Sir William Ashford, one of the kingdom's most promising diplomatic attachés. The three had been sharing what appeared to be a pleasant morning meal, complete with delicate finger sandwiches, imported teas, and an assortment of pastries that would have fed a peasant family for a week. The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. Lady Helena's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with trembling hands, her face draining of color as she registered the king's thunderous expression. Sir William shot to his feet so quickly that his chair toppled backward, his young face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. But it was Camilla's reaction that truly caught the king's attention. For just a fraction of a second, before her practiced court mask slipped into place, Edmund saw something flash across her features. Not surprise, not confusion, but calculation. Her green eyes darted toward a small writing desk in the corner of the room, before returning to meet his gaze with what appeared to be innocent concern. In that brief moment, the king realized that she knew exactly why he had come. "Your Majesty." Camilla rose gracefully, executing a perfect curtsy that would have been entirely appropriate under normal circumstances. "What an unexpected pleasure. We were just discussing the upcoming harvest festival. Lady Helena has such wonderful ideas for the decorations." Her voice was smooth as honey, betraying nothing of the treachery that had been revealed in her private correspondence. The king's eyes swept the room, taking in details he had never noticed during his previous visits. The positioning of the furniture that would allow clear sightlines to the door and windows. The mirror angled perfectly to reflect the corridor outside. The way certain books on the shelves were arranged to create subtle sightlines. Even in her personal chambers, Camilla had created an environment that facilitated surveillance and quick escape routes. "Lady Helena, Sir William." The king's voice was controlled but carried an undertone that made both young courtiers step back instinctively. "I require private words with Lady Camilla. Immediately." The dismissal was absolute, brooking no argument or delay. Lady Helena gathered her skirts and hurried toward the door, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Sir William followed close behind, but not before casting a worried glance at Camilla, who maintained her serene expression even as her world crumbled around her. The young man clearly had no idea what was unfolding, and his concern for someone he probably considered a family friend was evident in his hesitation at the threshold. "Go," Camilla said softly to William, her voice carrying just a hint of reassurance. "His Majesty and I have family matters to discuss." The way she emphasized the word family was not lost on the king, who recognized it as both a reminder of their supposed relationship and perhaps a subtle threat about the complications that might arise from moving against her. As the door closed behind the departing guests, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The pretense of pleasant social interaction evaporated, leaving only two people who now understood they were adversaries. Camilla moved to pour herself another cup of tea, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if demonstrating that she would not be intimidated by his presence. "You seem troubled, Edmund," she said, using his given name in a way that would have been familiar and appropriate just hours earlier, but now felt like a deliberate provocation. "Has something happened? Some crisis that requires the king to burst into a lady's private chambers without proper announcement?" The casual way she deflected his obvious anger, while simultaneously criticizing his breach of protocol, showed a level of sophisticated manipulation that made Edmund's skin crawl. This was not the grieving widow he had been protecting for 3 years. This was a trained agent, someone skilled in the arts of deception and misdirection. "Where are they, Camilla?" The king's voice was deadly quiet as he moved further into the room, his presence seeming to fill the space and make the luxurious chamber feel suddenly claustrophobic. "The other letters. The ones that weren't hidden with the collection we found this morning." For the first time, Camilla's composure cracked slightly. Her teacup paused halfway to her lips, and her eyes narrowed as she processed his words. She had been calculating how much they might know, how much she could deny or explain away. But the king's question told her that the game was over, that her carefully constructed facade had been completely stripped away. "I'm afraid I don't understand," she said, but her voice lacked the confident certainty it had carried moments before. "What letters? What collection? Has someone been spreading malicious gossip about me? You know how the court loves its scandals and rumors." The king reached into his coat and withdrew several of the damning documents that Lord Chancellor Aldridge had brought to him. The papers rustled in the sudden silence as he held them up, and Camilla's eyes fixed on her own handwriting with the intensity of a trapped animal spotting the bars of its cage. "Malicious gossip?" Edmund's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his controlled fury beginning to show. "Is that what you call detailed intelligence about our military defenses? Comprehensive maps of the palace layout? Plans to infiltrate foreign agents into the harvest festival?" With each accusation, His voice grew stronger, more commanding, until it filled the room with royal authority. Camilla set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap, her back straight and her chin raised in a gesture that might have been defiance, or simply the ingrained habits of aristocratic bearing. "You're making very serious accusations, Your Majesty. I hope you have more evidence than some papers that could have been forged by any number of people with reason to wish me ill." The audacity of her continued denial, even when confronted with irrefutable proof, sparked something dangerous in the king's chest. This woman had sat at his table, shared his concerns, listened to his private thoughts about the kingdom's challenges, and had been systematically betraying every confidence for 3 years. The violation went beyond politics or even national security. It was personal, familial, and cut to the very core of who he was as both a king and a man. Forged? The word came out as a snarl. "These letters are in your hand, written on paper bearing your personal seal, discussing information that only someone with intimate access to this palace could possess. They reference conversations I had with you personally, Camilla. Private conversations about matters of state that you had no legitimate reason to be documenting, much less sharing with foreign agents." The king moved closer to her, his imposing frame casting a shadow across her seated form. 3 years, he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. 3 years I opened my home to you, treated you as family, protected you, provided for you, and every day, every single day, you were working to destroy everything I've built, everything my ancestors built. Camilla finally stood, her movement sharp and sudden enough to make the king take a half step back. For the first time since he had entered the room, her mask slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the veneer of aristocratic charm. "And what if I was?" she asked, her voice now stripped of its previous honey-sweet tones. "What if everything you believe about me is true? What exactly do you think you can do about it?" The transformation was startling in its completeness. Gone was the grieving widow, the helpless woman in need of royal protection. In her place stood someone entirely different, confident, dangerous, and clearly unafraid of the consequences of her revelation. This was the real Camilla Thornfield, and she was nothing like the woman Edmund thought he had been sheltering. "You want to know what I can do?" The king's voice carried the full weight of royal authority, backed by centuries of absolute power and the divine right of kings. "I can have you arrested for treason. I can have you tried before a court that will find you guilty based on your own written confessions. I can have you executed in the public square as a warning to any other would-be traitors who think they can abuse the hospitality of this crown." But even as he spoke these words, Edmund could see that Camilla was not cowering before his threats. If anything, she seemed to be calculating, weighing options, considering possibilities that made his blood run cold. This was not a woman who had been caught unprepared. She had contingencies, escape routes, perhaps even allies within the palace walls that he knew nothing about. "Executed?" Camilla laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Oh, Edmund, you still don't understand the game you're playing, do you? You think this is about a few letters? About some information passed to Valdoria? You think you've caught a simple spy and can solve all your problems with a public execution?" The king felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that this confrontation was not ending the way he had anticipated. Camilla was not breaking down, not pleading for mercy, not even attempting to justify her actions. Instead, she was acting like someone who still held cards to play, someone who knew something he did not. "What game?" he demanded, his voice sharp with growing unease. "What are you talking about?" Camilla moved to her writing desk, her movements casual and unhurried despite the gravity of the situation. She opened a small drawer and withdrew what appeared to be another letter, this one sealed with wax and bearing an official-looking stamp. "The game where your beloved cousin Geoffrey didn't die in a hunting accident," she said conversationally as if discussing the weather. "The game where his death was just the opening move in a much larger strategy. The game where you're not the only one who has been gathering information for 3 years. The implication of her words hit Edmund like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making the room seem to spin around him. Geoffrey's death had been the tragedy that brought Camilla into the palace in the first place, the event that had moved him to extend his protection to his cousin's supposed widow. If that had been murder, if it had all been part of an elaborate plan, "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Too many pieces were suddenly falling into place. Jeffrey's unexpected decision to hunt alone that day, despite always preferring company. The condition of his body when it was found, which had puzzled the royal physician. The strange behavior of Jeffrey's horse, which had returned to the stables in a state of panic that seemed excessive even for an animal that had witnessed an accident. Camilla smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, the king saw something genuinely warm in her expression. But it was not the warmth of affection or familial love. It was the warmth of a predator savoring a successful hunt. "Am I?" she asked softly. "Are you willing to bet your kingdom on that assumption?" The sealed letter in Camilla's hand seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as she held it between them like a weapon. King Edmund's world had shifted so dramatically in the space of a few sentences that he found himself struggling to maintain his footing, both literally and metaphorically. The woman before him had revealed herself to be not just a spy but potentially a murderer, and now she was claiming to possess information that could threaten his entire kingdom. "You want to know what's in here?" Camilla asked, turning the letter over in her hands with deliberate slowness. "Documents proving that your cousin discovered my activities months before his death. Evidence that he was planning to expose me, to reveal everything to you. And most interesting of all, a detailed account of exactly how he was eliminated before he could become a problem." The king's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he processed the magnitude of what she was claiming. Jeffrey had been more than just a cousin. He had been Edmund's closest friend, his confidant, the brother he had never had by birth. They had grown up together in the palace, trained together, shared dreams of serving the kingdom side by side. If Camilla was telling the truth, then she had not only betrayed his trust, but had also robbed him of the person he loved most in the world. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper, carrying years of pain and confusion that Edmund had never fully understood until this moment. Why kill him? If you wanted information, if you wanted access to the palace, why not simply recruit him? Why murder? Camilla moved to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where Jeffrey and Edmund had spent countless hours as children, playing at being knights and dreaming of glorious adventures. "Because Jeffrey was incorruptible," she said simply. "Some people can be bought, some can be blackmailed, some can be seduced. But your cousin? He loved his kingdom, loved his family, loved his honor more than he loved his own life. The moment he discovered what I was, he became a threat that could only be eliminated." The casual way she discussed murdering a man she had supposedly loved, had supposedly married, chilled Edmund's blood. This was not passionate crime or a moment of desperation. This had been calculated, coldly planned, and executed with the precision of a professional killer. How long had she been planning Jeffrey's death? Had she married him always intending to kill him, or had circumstances forced her hand? "The hunting accident," Edmund said, his voice growing stronger as anger began to burn away the shock. "How did you do it? How did you murder my cousin and make it look like an accident?" Camilla turned back to face him, her expression almost pitying. "Oh, Edmund, you still think so small. I didn't kill Jeffrey myself. I'm many things, but I'm not a common murderer skulking about with poison or daggers. No, Jeffrey's death required something much more sophisticated, something that would leave no trace, no evidence, no reason for anyone to suspect anything other than tragic misfortune." She moved to an ornate cabinet and withdrew a small vial containing what appeared to be clear liquid. "This is essence of nightshade blossom, refined through a process known only to the alchemists of Valdoria. A single drop on the skin is absorbed immediately and causes temporary paralysis within minutes." Jeffrey thought he was going on a routine hunt, but his horse had been treated with this substance the night before. The king's stomach churned as he imagined the scene. Jeffrey, alone in the forest, suddenly losing control of his mount as the drug took effect. The fall that would have followed, the injuries that would have seemed entirely consistent with a hunting accident. The terror his cousin must have felt in those final moments, realizing something was wrong, but unable to understand what was happening to him. "You drugged his horse," Edmund said, the full horror of the plan becoming clear. "You sent him out to die knowing he would fall, knowing the injuries would be fatal. I sent him out to have an accident, Camilla corrected with chilling precision. His death was probable, but not guaranteed. If he had survived, if he had somehow managed to control his mount or minimize his injuries, well, there would have been other opportunities. But fortunately for my mission, the first attempt was sufficient. The king felt something dark and violent rising within him. A rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought. This woman had not only betrayed his trust and murdered his cousin, but she spoke of Jeffrey's death as if it were nothing more than a successful business transaction. The casual cruelty of it, the complete absence of any human emotion or regret, revealed a level of evil that he had never encountered before. "Guards!" The word exploded from Edmund's lips with such force that the windows seemed to rattle. "Guards! Attend your king!" But Camilla merely smiled, that same predatory expression that had chilled him earlier. "Oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said conversationally. "You see, that letter I mentioned? It contains more than just evidence of Jeffrey's murder. It also contains a very detailed account of your own activities over the past 3 years, activities that your nobles might find questionable." The king paused, his hand halfway to the door handle, as new dread crept up his spine. "What activities? What are you talking about?" "The midnight visits to Lady Margaret Clearwater's chambers," Camilla said, ticking off items on her fingers, as if reading from a shopping list. "The substantial loans from the royal treasury to cover your gambling debts. The secret negotiations with Valdoria that you've been conducting without the knowledge of your own council. The plans to increase taxes on the northern provinces to fund your personal building projects." Each accusation hit Edmund like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they were clever lies mixed with just enough truth to be believable. Yes, he had visited Lady Margaret, but only because she had been ill and he was concerned about a friend. Yes, there had been loans from the treasury, but they had been legitimate expenses for kingdom business. The gambling debts were completely fabricated, but how could he prove that? The secret negotiations were actually intelligence gathering that he had kept quiet to protect ongoing operations. "Those are lies," he said, but even to his own ears, his voice lacked conviction. "Lies and distortions that no one would believe, are they?" Camilla asked, moving closer with cat-like grace. "Are you willing to bet your throne on that assumption? Because you see, Edmund, I haven't just been gathering intelligence about military defenses and palace layouts. I've been documenting everything. Every visitor, every conversation, every decision that could be interpreted as questionable. 3 years of careful observation. 3 years of building a case against you that would make even your most loyal supporters question your fitness to rule." The king realized with growing horror that he was trapped. If he moved against Camilla publicly, she could release her fabricated evidence and potentially destroy his reputation, his relationships with his nobles, and his ability to govern effectively. But if he allowed her to remain in the palace, she would continue her espionage and potentially do even more damage to the kingdom's security. "What do you want?" he asked finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "What is your endgame here? What does Valdoria hope to gain from all this?" Camilla laughed, a sound of genuine amusement that was somehow more disturbing than her earlier coldness. "Oh, Edmund, you still don't understand. Valdoria doesn't want to conquer Ravencrest. That would be expensive, bloody, and ultimately unnecessary. No, they want something much more valuable. They want a puppet king, a ruler who appears independent but actually serves their interests." The full scope of the conspiracy began to dawn on the king. This had never been about gathering intelligence for a military invasion or a political coup. This had been about creating leverage, about gathering enough compromising information to control him completely. Camilla wasn't just a spy. She was meant to be his handler, the invisible hand that would guide his decisions in ways that benefited Valdoria while appearing to come from his own judgment. "You want to control me," he said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You want to remain here, in the palace, with access to everything, and use your leverage to influence my decisions. Now you're beginning to understand the game," Camilla said approvingly. "I stay here as your grieving cousin-in-law, continuing to enjoy your hospitality and protection. In exchange, I occasionally make suggestions about policy decisions that happen to align with Valdorian interests. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would seem suspicious to your advisors. Just gentle guidance from a family member who seems to have your best interests at heart. The king's mind raced as he tried to find a way out of the trap that had been so carefully constructed around him. Every option seemed to lead to disaster. If he arrested Camilla, she could release her fabricated evidence and destroy him politically. If he allowed her to stay, she would effectively be ruling his kingdom from the shadows, using his own authority to advance Valdorian interests. But as he stared at the woman who had murdered his cousin and betrayed his trust, Edmund felt something steel within him. He had been a good king, a just ruler who had always tried to put his people's interests first. He would not allow that legacy to be corrupted by blackmail and manipulation, no matter the personal cost. "No," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Camilla's eyes narrow. "I will not be your puppet. I will not allow you to use my throne to serve Valdorian interests, and I will not allow Geoffrey's murder to go unpunished." The king moved to the door and threw it open with decisive force. Captain Fletcher and 6 palace guards stood in the corridor, having responded to his earlier shout. Their faces showed confusion at the delay, but they snapped to attention as their sovereign appeared. "Captain Fletcher," the king commanded, his voice carrying across the chamber and into the hallway beyond. "Empty this room. Pack Lady Camilla's belongings immediately. She is no longer welcome in this palace." Camilla's face went white with shock and rage. "You're making a mistake, Edmund. A terrible mistake that will cost you everything you hold dear." The king turned back to her with cold eyes. "Perhaps, but some things are more important than political survival. Justice for Geoffrey is one of them. The integrity of this crown is another. Captain Fletcher, escort Lady Camilla from these premises immediately. She is banished from this kingdom and is never to return upon pain of death." As the guards moved into the room to carry out his orders, King Edmund walked away from the woman who had nearly destroyed everything he held sacred. Behind him, he could hear Camilla shouting threats and promises of revenge, but he did not look back. The game was over, and whatever consequences followed, he would face them as a true king should, with honor, courage, and an uncompromising commitment to justice.